Hello, and welcome to the Banff at Altitude podcast, celebrating 50 years of adventure storytelling from the Banff Centre Mountain Film and Book Festival. Since its beginning in 1976, the Banff Centre Mountain Film and Book Festival has been a gathering place in celebration of all things mountain culture. The yearly festival, hosted at Banff Centre for Arts and Creativity, fosters an appreciation of the world's mountain places by creating opportunities for people to share and find inspiration in mountain experiences, ideas, and visions. Over the years, we've spoken to hundreds of incredible adventurers who share their spectacular and moving stories. My name is Joanna Croston, and I'm going to be digging through our festival archives to revive some of our favorite presentations from the past to get you stoked for what's to come in 2025, our 50th anniversary. And well, hopefully you'll be stoked for life in general. In continuing with this tradition of sharing stories and connections, we hope this podcast will inspire you to explore, preserve, and enjoy the great outdoors. In this episode, we're going back to Kate Harris's 2018 presentation on her award-winning book, Lands of Lost Borders, Out of Bounds on the Silk Road. Harris's deep dive into the remote Central Asian steppe won her the Adventure Travel Book Award at our festival, as well as the 2019 RBC Taylor Prize for Literary Nonfiction and the Boardman Tasker Prize for Mountain Literature. Her weaving of travel narratives and personal reflection as she travels across the borders of the ancient Silk Road on her bike with her pal Mel pulls you into a world of true adventure. If you haven't already, I highly recommend buying her book Lands of Lost Borders at your local bookstore. Presented on our main stage, here is Kate Harris with Lands of Lost Borders.
All right, hello again. So tonight I'm going to talk about some of my misadventures on the edges of things, from nations to endurance to sanity at times. In other words, I'm going to talk about borders, and borders of all kinds and the ways they shape and shatter our world, from mountain ranges to people's minds. And to do that, I'll take you on a little bike ride on the Silk Road. But to start off, I want you to imagine a world without borders. No militaries or maps, no visas or barbed wire, no solid lines whatsoever except those drawn by the distant horizon. This might be a pretty difficult thought exercise in this day and age when walls loom larger than ever. But in 2006, when my best buddy Melissa and I biked up and onto the Tibetan Plateau, it felt like we'd entered exactly that kind of expansiveness. For weeks, we pedaled across this high-altitude wilderness, and it was like a land spread wide as wings, folded here and there into mountains. There were no trees, no grass, no greenery anywhere, just turquoise lakes glimmering in the distance like puddles of sky. And there were almost no movements across this landscape, nothing to move really except for the wind, which would send out dust tornadoes across the road ahead of us, and they would spin along in perfect silence. It was really eerie. So on a daily basis, the wild fact of being here basically knocked me off my bike, or maybe that was just the road, which wasn't much of a road. But I couldn't stop marveling at the wonder of being there. How on earth did we land in this otherworldly place? And the short answer is that we broke all the rules. Foreigners require permits and guides to legally enter the Tibetan Autonomous Region, as China now calls Tibet. And Mel and I had neither of these things. But we were heartened by the fact that some of the earliest explorers, European explorers in Tibet, also didn't have permission to go there, such as Heinrich Harrer. He was an Austrian mountaineer who was imprisoned in India during World War II, and he eventually escaped and made his way over the Himalayan mountains and all the way to the fabled city of Lhasa, where he befriended the Dalai Lama and famously lived for 7 years. But I was even more emboldened by an earlier explorer named Alexandra David-Néel. Now cheers for her. So in the year 1924, at the age of 55, this French woman snuck all the way across the Tibetan Plateau and into the forbidden city of Lhasa by disguising herself as a Buddhist pilgrim. Now, her disguise wasn't totally sacrilege. She was a Buddhist, but it was in defiance of the Tibetan authorities, who at the time forbid foreigners from coming to their country. Now, nowadays, it's the Chinese government that restricts access to Tibet. So Mel and I felt pretty justified in similarly sneaking in. We didn't want to pay for permits that would reinforce the power asymmetry between China and Tibet. And we also didn't want to be led around on a leash by guides. Plus, we just graduated from university and life seemed pretty unlimited. Never once had we met a wall that we couldn't somehow muscle over or under or past. So in the middle of the night, on the edge of the Tibetan Plateau, we dressed in our darkest, most criminal clothing, namely long underwear that was black, and we duct taped over the reflectors on our bicycles, on the pedals and the wheels, and then we biked right up to this checkpoint with a guardrail that was lowered in this town called Kuti, and climbed underneath it and pulled our bikes after us, and then we pedaled as fast as we could into forbidden territory. Now, admittedly, this was a new extreme for both Mel and I, but it wasn't totally out of character. Since the age of 10, when we met each other, we'd been propelling each other into places that neither of us would have dared go alone or dared visit alone, such as elementary school science fairs. So here we are. Now, if that's not a portrait of two young women as future explorers, I don't know what is. As you can tell, we were the coolest kids in school. Now, Mel and I grew up in small town Ontario, and it seemed to me that we grew up in a world of extremely diminished possibilities. I wanted to be an explorer when I grew up, one of those intrepid Shackleton or Nansen types with a appetite for cold gruel and disdain for the status quo and a knack for endless slogging. But when I looked around me in small town Ontario, the tallest mountain I could see was a haystack, and the widest horizon was a field of corn. And so it seemed I'd been born centuries too late, or at least continents away from the kind of life I was meant to live. And the more quaint and cultivated my surroundings, the more I craved the total opposite. Mountains and glaciers, deserts and tundra, basically the kind of wildness that could wipe me out if I wasn't equal parts bold and careful. And in small town Ontario, I found this wildness in books. One of my favorites, I was a voracious reader as a kid. I loved sci-fi in particular, but especially exploration narratives. And one of my favorite books when I was like 10 or 11 was this illustrated children's edition of Marco Polo's travels on the Silk Road, which is the fabled trade route that for 1,000 years ferried people, goods, and ideas between Europe and Asia. And this book had actually belonged to my mother when she was a child, and I loved seeing her maiden name scrawled on the inside cover as if endorsing the adventures described within. And its pages showed Polo, a 17-year-old roaming these far-flung lands by camel caravan, gazing off at wild horizons that melted into fantastic mirages. He looked bold, he looked rugged, he looked every bit the intrepid explorer, and I wanted to be just like him when I grew up. And in the meanwhile, I traced his travels on a map. That's the Silk Road, which is actually many roads, as it laced and frayed from Istanbul to Bukhara to Lhasa to Leh, and each name was like an invitation to elsewhere. But even more compelling to me as a little kid and still were the hinterlands between these fabled trading hubs. So places like the Tibetan Plateau. I found out later that Marco Polo really wasn't keen on this place. He actually hated it. He complained about Tibetans being the greatest bandits on earth. He complained about having to travel 20 days without finding a place to resupply, so you had to carry all your provisions. And he also complained about wild beasts so numerous and dangerous. So naturally, these warnings made Tibet all the more appealing. And another early favorite book of mine was My Journey to Lhasa by Alexandra David-Néel, and this is about her stealth journey across the plateau. This, to me, was the closest thing I'd found as a kid to a portrait of the explorer as a young woman. And never mind that she was 55 when she launched on this journey, age was far less relevant to me than motivation. For what propelled David-Néel out onto the plateau wasn't, she wasn't trying to find herself, which seemed to be a dominant narrative, at least in travel books written by women. She wasn't trying to find herself. She knew herself just fine. And what she seemed to be searching for, if anything, out on the plateau was a world on the outside that was as wild as she felt within. So in her book, she wrote about how she developed this homesickness for the Tibetan Plateau. Country that isn't mine, she wrote, the steppes, the solitude, the eternal snows and big skies up there haunt me. And after reading her book, I was similarly homesick for the Tibetan Plateau. I was pretty obsessed with going there someday. In the meanwhile, I looked at maps of it, and I was rather alarmed to discover there were already a whole bunch of roads snaking across it. Now, road might, again, be a euphemism for what these actually represent, but this scared me, and I worried that by the time I saved up enough money to go see Tibet for myself, it would look more like southern Ontario, as mapped and tamed and paved as the place I lived. And so I started to worry that I was wilder than the world in all directions that I could see. And I worried that there was no outlet left on this planet for the kind of restlessness that ached inside me, this longing for a world without maps. And my only hope, as I came to realize as a teenager, was to leave the Earth behind, and I would have to go to Mars. Now, Mars appealed to me as a planet of exploratory first waiting to happen, but also as a place where sort of the biggest questions about life in the universe might be answered, like, are we alone? Mars might have been a warmer, wetter planet at one point, more Earth-like, and I thought it was pretty thrilling that we could go there and maybe answer that age-old question. So I studied really hard at school in hopes of launching myself there someday, in hopes of becoming an astronaut and going there. And I really didn't doubt this extraterrestrial mission in life until I had the chance as an undergraduate student, I was in my sophomore year, to take part in this 2-week Mars simulation at the Mars Desert Research Station. And the Mars Desert Research Station is located in Hanksville, Utah. You may never have heard of Hanksville because it's basically as red and remote from human concerns as Mars, but it's mostly famous as the desert hideout of Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch. So these guys would shake off law enforcers in its maze of red canyons. And nowadays, those same canyons host crews of wannabe Martians wearing fake spacesuits who go through all the motions of being on another world in order to research what that will actually take to live on Mars. So picture cattle tracks, clumps of sagebrush, and a white space capsule gleaming in front of a wilderness gone to rust. So for a while it was fun. It was like a grown-up game of make-believe. But as I wandered around this gorgeous wilderness wearing this spacesuit, this canvas onesie, I was disconcerted by the fact that whenever I looked at a mountain, I would see this veneer of plexiglass. And whenever I reached out to touch sandstone, the color of embers, I would just feel the synthetic fabric of my glove. And as all kinds of weather howled outside my plastic helmet, all I could hear was radio static or my own percussive panting amplified in the helmet, like I was breathing down my own neck. And so the very technologies that would keep me alive on Mars made me feel at a deep remove from the place. My interactions with it neutered and sterile and more than slightly absurd, especially when we ran out of food on the red planet and we had to go to the local grocery store wearing spacesuits to resupply rations. So after 2 weeks of speaking in acronyms, reporting my every move to a mock mission control, and breathing recycled air, I'd really had my fill of living on Mars. And so on the final night of the simulation, I snuck outside without waiting in the airlock first, without putting on my spacesuit. I just stepped out into that desert and I could smell the air spiced with sage. Then I looked up at a night sky that seemed tacked up with stars. So all this made me question what I was really after in exploration. Is it really about precedent and planting the first flags, leaving the first footprints? And so I thought back to some of my childhood heroes who were explorers, like people like Marco Polo and Alexander David Neal, and realized that when you think about it, all they did was travel to lands that were new to them, but old to others, and then write about what they saw. Could it be so simple? This gave me incredible hope. Now, explorers aren't worth worshiping across the board. Of course, Marco Polo, as I discovered later, was a merchant. He wasn't motivated by sort of curiosity and wonder and wanting to know what lay around the next bend so much as commodities and profits and doing his duties for Kublai Khan. And Alexander David Neal, I learned, developed an avid interest in the stock market late in her life. Now, I'm a writer, I can sympathize, but I wanted to be the kind of explorer that wasn't about fame and fortune or conquest and commerce. And I figured that the Silk Road would be a fitting place to kind of celebrate none of those things and focus instead on the landscapes that lay in between the fabled trading hubs that I mentioned, especially Tibetan Plateau. So I got this idea that I wanted to see the Silk Road for myself, and I figured that a bicycle would be easier than a camel caravan, and it would come with the added bonus of being less likely to spit at me. Now, At the time, I was on a break, or I was approaching my summer holidays at the end of my university degree, and I was going off to grad school in the fall, and so I only had a few months. And so I figured that instead of biking the entire Silk Road, which wasn't really feasible, I could focus on the place that boasted the most number of landscapes that Marco Polo most feared and dreaded, which was China. So it contained the Tibetan Plateau. So I called my parents and announced to them what I planned to do, and there was a long silence on the phone, possibly because I didn't own a bicycle at the time, nor did I know how to fix a flat tire, and I had no money. But they sort of heard me out, and then they asked me if I would please go with a friend. And so I asked my buddy Mel if she was interested in a little bike ride on the Silk Road. And she agreed faster than you can say Marco Polo. She was in right away. And the two of us had just recently run the New York City Marathon on a bit of a whim. And so cycling the Silk Road seemed the next logical step. And so that's how we eventually found ourselves sneaking under a guardrail into Tibet while the guards snored and the stars looked the other way. Now, as it turned out, our stealth tactics didn't really matter. The authorities couldn't be bothered with us. The only thing soldiers wanted to stop us for on the road was to take photos of us with their cell phones or test ride our bikes. And this was a relief, especially when we were passed on the road by military convoys, which were like the closest thing to dangerous wild beasts we encountered in Tibet. But it was also something of a disappointment. There I was flouting the law for the first time in my squeaky clean existence, and no one even cared. But the sobering side of that is that the checkpoint we'd snuck across wasn't really meant to keep foreigners out so much as to keep Tibetans in. So in the 1950s, the People's Republic of China invaded the formerly sovereign nation of Tibet and forced the Dalai Lama under some duress to sign over sovereignty. And the People's Republic of China called this liberation, and Tibetans called it occupation. As a result, the Dalai Lama eventually fled Tibet to save his life, and hundreds of thousands of Tibetans followed him into exile over the decades to come. And those that stayed behind were essentially resigned to being prisoners in their own country, denied religious freedoms, all kinds of freedoms, denied meaningful passports. Now, taking sides in any modern geopolitical conflict requires a certain amount of historical amnesia. Tibet's own history is blighted by acts of greed and colonialism. In the 7th and 8th centuries, the Tibetan Empire actually spanned into huge swaths of what is now China. Like, they occupied Chinese cities. They were the overlords at one point. And this is not to downplay what the Chinese government's doing in Tibet, more just to take a bigger perspective. It's very easy to sort of categorically think of Chinese as bad and Tibetans as good in this situation. But the Dalai Lama himself, who eventually won the Nobel Peace Prize for his nonviolent opposition to the occupation of Tibet, he says whenever he looks at a Tibetan, he doesn't see a good Tibetan and a bad Chinese. He sees a potentially good Tibetan and a potentially good Chinese. And Mel and I tried to be that open-minded as we biked through Tibet, but a lot of what we saw built a pretty forceful case for bias, like destroyed monasteries that we passed. Now, admittedly, I'd spend more time musing about history and borders when I was back home and better able to breathe. On the Tibetan Plateau, where the flattest plain loomed taller than most peaks in North America, I was pretty preoccupied with just sucking oxygen into my lungs. I was also preoccupied with staying upright on these roads. They were barely there a lot of the time. They would look like a spill of rubble, sort of undistinguishable from the rest of a mountain's rubble, or they'd be covered in streams. This is Mel posing with her tire, which has been basically sanded down to nothing on the gritty roads. And it didn't help that we were burdened with tents, sleeping bags, repair kits, food, a whole bunch of books, which were essential traveling gear. Basically everything we needed to survive, just barely. There was never enough to eat, and Mel and I basically wasted to bone on a diet of instant noodles mixed with peanut butter for dinner and instant oatmeal mixed with peanut butter for breakfast, and a few nuts and stale cookies in between. But even if places had been available on the plateau for resupplying our rations, those would have been useless to us because we had stashed our last $100 bill, which was our emergency money, in the handlebars, the hollow metal tubing of my bike. And after 4 months on the road, it was effectively welded to the aluminum inside. So I was riding around this useless piggy bank. But none of it mattered, not in the least, because the Tibetan Plateau itself was just so sublime, it justified any hardship that we faced in being there. Being there felt to me like what I'd always longed for in my mind in going to another world, in going to Mars, only it was better because I could breathe, I could laugh out loud, I could feel the wind on my face. And as I experienced in Utah, spacesuits tend to wall you off from all that. So Mel and I finished this trip craving the sort of intimacy with immensity that a bike trip delivers on a daily basis, especially if you're in a place like Tibet. And we also finished this trip with a pretty serious grudge against borders, the way they exist for some people and not for others, the ways they fragment lands and lives. And so we vowed to each other that someday we would finish the Silk Road we'd left untraveled, namely the huge swath of ground in between Europe and China. And 5 years later, we did. This time we set off from Istanbul in Turkey, and we spent 10 months traveling through 10 countries all the way to northern India. Adventure wasn't the only point of this trip. We really wanted to search out the wildness that thrives beyond, between, and despite borders. And I'll give you a couple examples of what I mean before we head back to Tibet. So first, the Kars Plateau in eastern Turkey. Turkey enjoys a temperate climate for the most part, but Kar is the Turkish word for snow, and the plateau spells it out in the plural, at least when we went through there in February. It looks like Mel's having a grand time cartwheeling down this road for joy, but she's actually trying to centrifugally force blood back to her extremities because they're so frozen. So when we were in Kars, we took a little detour to this ancient city of Ani, and this used to be the capital of Armenia, and it was a major trading hub on the Silk Road, and now it's mostly ruins on the modern border of Turkey. And the border between Turkey and Armenia has been hermetically sealed off due to conflict for the past 2 decades, so humans have been banned from going inside, and the border is formed by this canyon, specifically the river, but the canyon edges it, which is fenced with barbed wire all along it, and no one until recently knew what was going on inside it. But a local biologist petitioned the Turkish armed forces for permission to trek the entire length of this canyon because he wanted to survey for biodiversity. He was curious what had happened to wildlife in the interim, and it was a very tame place before the border was sealed up. For example, there were bridges crossing it, and it was the center of Ani. And what this biologist discovered was that in the interim, Egyptian vultures, which is a very threatened species of raptor, had moved in. He found like 6 or half dozen nests of these very endangered species in this canyon. So there's no explaining borders to the birds, but they definitely know a sanctuary when they see one. And I was torn between wanting to, applaud this oasis of wildness while despairing the fact that it took strife to create it. Is that something to be heartened by or horrified by? I'm still not entirely sure. Now, a little further down the Silk Road, we went to another sort of river that defined another border, this time the Pianj River on the edge of Tajikistan and Afghanistan. And we followed this river to its source, which is Zorkul Lake, high on the Pamir Plateau. So we're at about 13,000 feet here. And this is where the river disappeared into the lake, and the road disappeared in the grass, and all signs of a frontier vanished with it. And on the mountains all around us, once we became attuned to their presence, were thousands of Marco Polo sheep. And this is a species of wild sheep that was named after Marco Polo, even though he obviously wasn't the first to discover it, he just wrote about it. They basically can migrate across nations here, oblivious to the lines inscribed on our maps. And Mel and I were tempted to follow the herds, but fears of landmines kept us within limits that we couldn't even see. Now, while we were on the Pamir Plateau, we had an invitation from this trophy hunting camp to stay at their camp for a few days. And we hesitated in accepting it because we're not fans of hunting, especially when it's not for the sake of sustenance, but an ego-boosting wall decoration. But we went there, and we were amazed to learn that foreigners will pay up to $25,000 US to harvest a pair of these horns in order to hang them on their wall. Now, a gunshot is a singular act of violence against an innocent creature, and as such, it's pretty easy to condemn. But what we realize is that there's a slower, more complicated violence at work in Tajikistan, which is life in a country with very few options. So Tajikistan is the poorest of all the former states of the Soviet Union, and the fact is Marco Polo sheep are going to be hunted no matter what, often poached by villagers because they're desperate for meat or the money that meat will bring on the black market. So it's not a question of are sheep going to die, it's more a question of who's going to pull the trigger. Is it going to be a local who is just trying to survive, or is it going to be a foreign trophy hunter who is willing to pay a fortune, and that money ultimately filters into the local communities in the form of jobs? And it also means that Marco Polo's sheep, these hunting conservancies, are incentivized to protect the sheep. And in a place like Tajikistan, where national parks don't have the funding that we enjoy in Canada, conservation doesn't happen there the way it does here. They don't have rangers patrolling fenced perimeters and enforcing fines when things go awry. So in a weird way, we realize that trophy hunters are the kind of unwitting heroes of wildlife conservation in Tajikistan, this incredibly poor country. And when Marco Polo sheep thrive, so do the snow leopard that feed on them. And Tajikistan has some of the highest densities of snow leopard populations in the world. So what these experiences hit home for me is that exploration isn't about planting flags and leaving footprints. It isn't about how far you can go and how much you can suffer. It's really about how willing you are to let an experience rewrite your maps. Now, the maps of the world are going to be rewritten, whether you will it or not. And this is the solace in some ways and the sadness in other ways of the Silk Road. The fact of flux. It's always changing, just as the larger world is. When Marco Polo traveled through this swath of the world, it was ruled by powers that are they're different or dissolved now. And when Alexandra David-Néel walked across the plateau, she walked a different world than we do today. And even in the 5 years spanning our 2 bicycle trips across it, we met a different world. So the Tibet we returned to, the roads were paved and lined with power lines. There was cell service all across the plateau. The tiny town I live in British Columbia doesn't even have cell service yet, but all across the Tibetan Plateau, you can call people. There's a high-speed train now from Beijing to Lhasa, and rather more depressingly, as a result of increasingly violent confrontations between the Chinese government and peacefully protesting Tibetans, there are now checkpoints not just on the periphery of the Tibetan Autonomous Region, but the entrance and exit of almost every village. But foreigners still require permits and guides to go there. So we knew this would take some serious stealth in the form of disguising ourselves as androgynous Chinese cyclists. Now, this sounds ludicrous, but in the 5 years since we were there last, it seems to have become a really popular thing for young, adventurous Chinese people to bike from Golmud in the Qinghai province to Lhasa. And they happen to, wear clothes, they're fully covered, they wear face masks to ward off dust and sun. And so we realized that if we disguised ourselves as much as possible like them, if we flew a Chinese flag on our bikes, we could probably enjoy the same autonomy and freedom that Chinese people have in Tibet. Namely, they don't need permits and guides. And when they approach checkpoints, the guards tend to assume that they're Chinese, because they usually are. There's so many of them. We would pass probably 6 to 10 a day going one way or the other. And the guards just let them go through. They don't make them stop. So that was our whole plan. Now, of course, if we said anything to anyone, the roost would be up immediately because we didn't speak Mandarin. And so this meant we really had to avoid people. We had to carry all the rations we needed for a month to cross the plateau. So there were places that we could have resupplied. There were towns along the way, but we didn't want to stop in them for fear of getting caught. And it meant we had to hide our campsite every night. So this lovely spot here is better known to locals as a garbage pit. And it worked. We biked past Chinese police and they didn't even blink. It really worked. There were a couple checkpoints that were run by the military that we had to deke around at night, but for the most part it worked. But our disguises came at a serious cost. By looking Chinese, we had freedom to move across Tibet, but it also meant that Tibetans didn't want much to do with us because we looked Chinese. at the same time, we didn't want to interact with Tibetans too much because we didn't want to implicate them in our pretty illegal and ultimately kind of stupid stunt. We didn't want to rope them into that. So it meant that a lot of the time there I felt a bit like a ghost. It was little bit reminiscent of being at the Mars Desert Research Station in Utah. It was almost like I was back behind plexiglass. I was in Tibet, but not fully of it. There were a couple occasions on which we tore off our face masks, though. The first was to cuddle with baby Tibetan antelope, because who could resist a face like this? Mel basically found her calling here and didn't want to leave. This is a rehabilitation center for Tibetan antelope that are either orphaned or injured because of the increasing traffic on highways there or the high-speed railway. So that was one instance. And then the second one was when we saw some pilgrims ahead on the road. We didn't take our face masks off right away. We biked right up to them, but initially we didn't even know what these strange figures were doing in the distance. They would basically stand up, take a step forward, slide to their knees, their hands, their foreheads, stretch out on the ground, stand up, raise their hands above their heads, take a few steps forward and repeat the ritual. And they would basically repeat this ritual all the way to Lhasa or enlightenment, whatever they reached first. And we were so impressed. Mel and I tried to travel as lightly as possible, carrying the minimal amount of food and gear we needed to cross the plateau, but these two carried nothing but the clothing they wore. They wore wooden paddles to protect their hands from the pavement, and they wore these leathery aprons to protect their bodies, but their foreheads were bare, and in the middle of each of them was this coin-sized callus, this sort of third and unblinking eye, caused by the friction between their skin and the road. And so we biked up to them with our Chinese flags flapping and our face masks on, and it was one of the rare occasions that a Tibetan didn't look away or flinch. They looked right at us, and we pulled our face masks down when we got to them, and they thought this was hilarious, that we weren't who they thought we were. But I just felt like they didn't assume we were Chinese, they didn't assume we were a threat, they didn't assume we were strangers, they just assumed we were potentially good people. And eventually parted ways. We gave them some Snickers bars, and they're totally reliant on people's kindness along the way for food and shelter. And as we biked off, I watched them in the handlebar mirror recede and shrink behind us, and I'd watch as transport trucks veered really close to them, and I would hold my breath hoping I'd see them rise again, and they would. And I thought about how, with every step, every repetition, those calluses, those scars on their head would get denser and grow to this darker and more permanent shine. And, sometimes scars are a kind of protection, and sometimes even wilderness needs a wall. And in a way, I think we're all starved for whatever it is that propelled those pilgrims to their feet. Some kind of faith or hope or source of meaning for our brief stint under the stars. And especially in an age when the weather is so uncertain, the powers that be are so depressing, it's really easy to sort of slink into despair or cynicism, escapism, whether into despair or whether into Netflix binges or into dreaming about moving to another world is extremely seductive. And whenever I'm tempted by it, which is fairly often, I try to think about those pilgrims. I think about them making their way down an indifferent road in a country no longer theirs, and I think about them moving through the world as if the most immense responsibility to it is wonder. The poet T.S. Eliot famously wrote that the end of all our exploring is to arrive back where we started and know the place for the first time. But after biking the Silk Road, I don't actually think he went far enough. The end goal isn't knowledge. It isn't a deeper quantitative understanding of how things work. I really think the point of exploring is to not just come to know this place, but to come to care about it, to feel a sense of loyalty and belonging and even devotion to it. This world might be broken, but it's also beautiful, and it might be paved in many places, but it's also incredibly wild in others, sometimes in the most surprising places. Ultimately, this planet is the only home we have in all the universe, the only place we can actually breathe. And if that's not reason enough to take good care of it and each other, I don't know what is. So ultimately, that's my great hope. I'll finish off now with, my big hope for what exploration, whether in words or in the world, can do. Wake us up to wonder again, shake us from complacency, and make us fall so in love with this world that we're never again tempted, as I once was, to abandon it for Mars. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed hearing about Kate's journey on the Silk Road as much as we did. If you liked this presentation, make sure to buy Kate's book or check out her other works at kateharris.ca. Join the festivities and help us celebrate 50 years of adventure stories at the heart of the festival here in Banff. Check out our website at banffmountainfestival.ca. This episode was produced by Anique C. and is a production of Banff Centre for Arts and Creativity. The theme music was composed by Jacques Blackstone. A special thanks to our audio engineer Ben Ewing and the production team at Banff Centre, as well as the folks from the Paul D. Fleck Library.